So, fair warning, today I'm kinda coming out swinging. Hi everyone, this is John from Incendium D&D, and we have some things to discuss today. Warlock, frankly, is a class that frustrates me on a number of levels. Ian and I have had a lot of discussions back and forth why, and today I just kinda want to dive into it. I'm gonna be doing my fair share of analyzing, complaining, and offering some solutions to what I think could make its design more fun at the table, as well as address some of the counter arguments I've recently received from it. If you want some context and want to dive into some of our conversations about the topic, you can check out our podcast, Dragon Mind, which is available through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcasting apps. The link to our Warlock episode is in the description below. With that out of the way, let's get rolling. In 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, Warlock is a spellcasting class themed around uncovering arcane secrets through pacts made with supernatural beings, including fae, fiends, and aberrations. As 5e has expanded, other options have become available, such as making pacts with celestials, genies, undead, and even sentient magic items. This deal with the devil storyline has been explored in real-world mythology for centuries. It gives the Warlock story this air of danger and mystery, and the imagery of a lot of its spells and features are dark and sinister in nature. Here are just some of the descriptions. Tendrils of dark energy erupt from you and batter all creatures within 10 feet of you. You point your finger and the creature that damaged you is momentarily surrounded by hellish flames. You open a gateway to the dark between the stars, a region infested with unknown horrors. This void is filled with a cacophony of soft whispers and slurping noises that can be heard up to 30 feet away. Because of this evocative imagery and compelling conflict through the storytelling hook of the deal with the devil, Warlock is a class that, through its story, can draw in a lot of different players. Not to mention that its features seem to be designed around this theme of having this massive amount of power. So how does it accomplish this mechanically? Well, that's where my frustrations start. One thing I've mentioned in previous videos, and I will continue to stand by, is that flavor only matters if it's properly supported with mechanics. Otherwise, the storytelling becomes shallow, because it doesn't matter how awesome an idea is if its execution is fumbled. So let's go back to one of the spells that I had described earlier, which is Arms of Hadar. You know, tendrils of dark energy erupt from the ground and batter the creatures around you. That sounds really cool, until you roll 2d6 bludgeoning damage, and it turns out like you deal 5 damage to everyone. So yeah, dark tendrils erupt. Did those mechanics live up to the cinematic setup from that spell's description? Warlock's entire class design is like this. There are all these ideas that sound good, but in play are more often than not really disappointing. Let's look at the Warlock's main feature, Pact Magic. Unlike other spellcasters that use the spellcasting trait, Pact Magic instead only gives the Warlock a limited number of spell slots at the highest level. The main drawback is that through the majority of their progression, they only get 2 spell slots, and they can only cast spells at their highest available level. There's a theoretical balance here, where Warlocks get powerful spells more often, but that assumes a very specific style of play that not every, and in my experience most, tables don't play by. You see, from my understanding, 5th edition was designed to have 6 to 8 combat encounters per long rest, with some short rests sprinkled in between. In all honesty, I don't think I've ever played a game that has more than 3 combats per long rest. And even in the context of a single fight, Warlocks are virtually restricted to only 2 leveled spells, while other classes like Clerics, Druids, Wizards, Sorcerers get this whole bevy of spell slots to use, especially for something like a set-piece encounter. Yes, Warlocks get their spell slots back more often, theoretically, but in practice, what I find is that in bigger boss fights, Warlocks just end up contributing less. they're relegated to just being damage dealers. It really says something when Ranger has a wider selection of spells it can cast than Warlock. And how does the community feel about this? Well, they can't make up their mind. I can't get a straight answer out of them. One time during our back and forth discussions, Ian decided to reach out on social media. He said that from a power scale perspective, 2 levels of Warlock and a lot of levels of Sorcerer seemed to outcompete a single-classed Warlock. So first of all, was anyone willing to play a solo-classed Warlock from a power scale perspective? Or what would have to change for that to happen? Overwhelmingly, the feedback he received is that Warlock needed a complete redesign. That, as is, Warlock is never going to compete with a Sorlock multiclass. Which is fair, so, we started thinking of some solutions. And the main thing I want to address here, I understand that Warlock is theoretically balanced, but in play, I have had an overwhelming amount of players tell me that playing a Warlock is just boring. You're not making a lot of clever choices, even in the build process. It's mostly just Eldridge Blast the target, roll to hit. And not only is a Sorlock multiclass more powerful, it's more interesting, because you get to Eldridge Blast and quicken a leveled spell together in the same turn. In fact, in my latest game, one of my players who's playing a single class Warlock told me, there are all these interesting spells I want to at least try to cast. Arms of Hadar, Armor of Agathis, Hunger of Hadar. However, they told me that because they only have 2 spell slots to use, it always feels like those spells aren't worth it to use half of their overall casting ability. So for this player, I tried an experiment. Instead of using Pact Magic, I just had them take a normal spellcasting progression for their level. So, the player at the time was like level 7. They had 1 4th level spell slot, 3 3rd level spell slots, so on, so on. And then because of that, they felt free to try a whole bevy of different spells they were uncomfortable with to begin with. Rather than just casting 4th level Misty Steps, which doesn't upscale, they decided to try things like Arms of Hadar. And they felt more comfortable using Hex in minor fights because they didn't have to use their highest level spell slot to cast it. Again, Hex does not upscale. I mean, technically it does, but it's not like it adds more damage or anything. Overall, that player was much more satisfied playing a single class Warlock than they would have been had I been strict about keeping Pact Magic. So, with the release of our Warlock podcast episode, I decided to ask Reddit what their thoughts were about giving Warlocks a full spell slot progression. And here are some of the replies. Warlock functions fine as is. Mystic Arcanum is fine. If you give them a full spell slot progression, why not just play a wizard or a sorcerer? It's a failure of the DM. If they allow Warlocks a decent amount of short rests per day, DMs seem to think that the Warlock would be overpowered. You'd need to remove their at-will casting. What? What did I just read? None of this has at all been my experience. Let's start with the most egregious. Warlock is fine as is. That is the complete opposite answer that Ian got when he asked social media. So which is it? Is it fine as is? Or is it something that needs a redesign? If you have to multi-class with a different class entirely to embody the main iconic features of the class you actually wanted, that class isn't fine as is. I think the real problem here, and everybody knows it, is Eldritch Blast. Because it's a cantrip, it scales with total character level. Meaning that after you take 2 levels of Warlock and you can pick up Agonizing Blast and another free invocation of your choice, there's no need to stick with Warlock. You'll get the most out of Eldritch Blast, whether you stick with it or not. So why wouldn't you take all of the versatility of Sorcerer? And again, if you give Warlocks a full spell slot progression, this next one really irritated me, why not just play a Wizard? I mean, they'd be exactly the same. I even got a comment that said their spell lists are almost exactly the same. Sure. Except, Absorb Elements, Shield, Featherfall, Hideous Laughter, Fireball, Silvery Barbs, Tasha's Mind Whip. Yeah, those aren't iconic wizard spells at all. And the Warlock totally has access to all of them in its base spell list. Also, ritual casting at all. Here's another one. If you give Warlocks normal slot progression, you need to heavily nerf their invocations. And at that point, you're just playing a wizard with different subclass abilities. But you know, Sorcerer, almost the exact same spell list as a wizard, with different subclass abilities. We're not going to talk about that one.
My goodness, what an idea. Why didn't I think of that?
Warlocks aren't wizards. Their spell lists are very, very different. In fact, depending on your subclass, your expanded spell lists include options wizards don't have access to. How many wizards at your table have you seen solo classed, casting Fairy Fire, Command, Dissonant Whispers, Plant Growth? And sure, some of the expanded spell lists may overlap with wizards. You can get Fireball through the Fiend Patron, you can get Hideous Laughter through Grey Old One, but Warlock isn't getting the iconic spells that wizards are known for. If anything, they're spells like Charm Person or Protection from Evil and Good, which aren't wizard spells. What's really the difference between a bard and a wizard? And finally, you need to nerf their invocations, or you need to get rid of their at-will casting. Yes, those big, bad, overpowered invocations. Alright, first of all, it's a widely accepted fact that most D&D games are played between 1st and 10th level. Variety of reasons, but let's have that as our base assumption for just a second. At most, your Warlock is probably going to have 5 invocations that they can choose from. Some of these do offer at-will casting. Let's take a look at some of these overpowered spells you need to nerf in order to make them just like a wizard. You know, Mage Armor, Speak with Animals, Detect Magic, False Life, Disguise Self, Silent Image. Yes, the colossal amount of horror stories over campaigns that have been broken due to at-will castings of Speak with Animals. The horror needs to be nerfed. What? Let's look at some of these other game-breaking invocations. Beguiling Influence, Proficiency in Deception and Persuasion. Yes, so different than the skilled feat. Devil's Sight, 120-foot normal vision through magical darkness, but still disadvantage on perception checks in normal darkness. Eyes of the Runekeeper, I can read all writing. No, the most powerful invocations are ones that augment Eldritch Blast. That has nothing to do with the wizard spell list. And again, like I said, there is very little overlap between the Warlock and Wizard spell lists. The things that are truly likely to make a Warlock powerful are things like Agonizing Blast, Repelling Blast, Grasp of Hadar, which you can also pick up with the Eldritch Adept feat on a Sorlock without a hefty Warlock investment. And yeah, you know what? There are some powerful invocations later. Like, I think Witch Sight is pretty awesome, but you need 15 levels of Warlock before you get it. Oh, and this other one, where somehow the Warlock being able to cast 5th level spells on short rests, that's somehow super powerful. Have you read the Warlock spell list? Most of their, iconic spells don't upcast. You can't upcast Misty Step, Hex, Hunger of Hadar. A lot of these spells have evocative, thematic descriptions, but very poor mechanics. No, the real power of D&D spellcasting isn't what spell slot level you cast at. It's the versatility. It's the ability to use the appropriate tool based on the context of the situation. And part of using that tool is choosing the spell slot level that you have access to. Really, the only good argument, and it's not even that good, is just that Warlock spellcasting is, different. It's mechanically unique, and most people just don't want to lose that uniqueness, even if that uniqueness is inferior in almost every aspect of play. Calm down, John. Calm down. I know, if this was kind of your thought train, or I somehow called out an argument you might have, you are very unlikely to be swayed by some random content creators ranting. And to be honest, even with a full normal spell slot progression, that doesn't fix the fact that Warlock spells just don't scale well, especially since Eldritch Blast is far and away the best option a Warlock has access to, and it can do that as many times as it wants for free. So let's move on to some solutions. And I'm gonna be frank, I'm just kind of spitballing these. Ian and I have plans to playtest a lot of these theories we're coming up with, so perhaps later we can give you a more refined version of what these might look like. But I think if you were really to redesign the Warlock, make it something that's a viable option, as opposed to having a much better multi-class combination, the first thing to address is the Eldritch Blast mechanics. For Eldritch Blast, instead of having it be a cantrip, I would have it be a class feature, which I guess is the way that it used to work in 3.5. But if it's a class feature, first, other classes aren't going to be able to pick it up with Magic Initiate, and a sorcerer isn't going to be able to quicken it because it's a class feature, not a spell. So already you circumvent that exploit. Second, you have it scale with Warlock levels, in a similar way of how Bardic Inspiration scales with Bard levels and Sneak Attack scales with Rogue levels. That way, the only way to get more beams would be to keep investing in Warlock. Next, I would remove the invocations that revolve around augmenting your Pact Boon or augmenting your Eldritch Blast. Hear me out here. First, I think I would tie Agonizing Blast into the Warlock progression. So maybe like at second level, you automatically get Agonizing Blast, and then you have 2 invocations to pick from. Those invocations would be more on the at-will spell casting, enhancing the Warlock's overall ability sort of thing. So, things like Devil's Sight, Eldritch Sight, Speak with Animals at will, and I'd probably just have invocations be more about utility magic. So yeah, the Warlock is a spellcaster, but it's made very clear that they're not using spell slots in the same way a sorcerer or wizard might. But also, if you want some shenanigans, maybe Warlock is the way to go. Yeah, they can cast Disguise Self, but at will. And you're also more likely to use it because now you're not choosing between Agonizing Blast and Disguise Self at will. You get Agonizing Blast, and you also get some of these fun utility spells at will. Now that being said, we're not throwing those other invocations out, the ones that augment your Pact Boon or Eldritch Blast. Instead, we just integrate that in the Warlock's leveling progression. So I'm imagining something at 7th level. Like Hunter Ranger, how you get a menu of 3 choices when you hit 7th level? Something where it's alright, you get to improve your Eldritch Blast further. Would you like to add Repelling Blast, Eldritch Spear, or Grasp of Hadar? Which of those 3 is going to go with your build? And the same for the Pact Boon, maybe something at 9th level. If you're Pact of the Blade, you get a menu of options. Extra attack, Eldritch Smite, something else you do with Pact of the Blade. I think that something like that could retain the Warlock's theme of customizability. But again, instead of making better options or worse options, you're choosing between what options fit your character without compromising its mechanical performance. I don't know, that's kind of where my head's at with it at the moment. And also, I think that kind of thing fits the Warlock's story of uncovering invocations over time, finding a secret, perhaps dangerous, esoteric way of casting spells that are outside of the normal limited span that spell slots provide. Again, I don't think that if you just take Warlock as is and do a full spell slot progression, it's gonna play exactly like a wizard. That sounds like the argument of someone that hasn't actually done that. Anyways, again, I was just spitballing those solutions. I'm curious what you guys have to think about it. Do you think I'm just a D&D kook? Or do any of these suggestions intrigue you? Thanks for listening to my rant today, everybody. As usual, if you like this video, make sure to give us a like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and have an awesome day. Bye-bye now.